When you're working in mixed media, especially if you're doing ink wash or acrylic wash or watercolor, and you're using a lot of water, if you don't have thick paper and you're using a pad that is white paper, it's not newsprint, but it's just not receiving water that well and the paper starts to wrinkle, then I recommend taping your paper to a board, a drawing board, or any type of board you can get your hands on that will fit the size of your paper, and using tape that when you peel it off, it won't take the paper surface with it. So you could use blue tape, like painter's tape, although you might want something stronger if you're using a lot of water because you want it to keep it stretched. Now this paper, for example, I didn't press down terribly hard, and so it is starting to come up a little bit here, but it served its purpose, and when I peel it off, this piece is going to be beautiful and flat, and that's a great way to make a mixed media piece if you aren't going to invest in really expensive thick paper that will hold multiple mediums. So we're going to talk about ink washes and then using our pastels on top of ink wash. Whether you're using water-soluble neo pastels or oil or chalk pastels, they'll all work for this process. So this is what got me so excited about working in mixed media, especially when I was working for a model, is I would use an ink wash to just feel out the space that I'm going for. So underneath this chalk pastel drawing is an ink wash, which if you come a little closer, you could see that ink wash finding the shape. And sometimes it's easier to find big shapes like that. Whereas if I had approached this just sort of starting with the head or the hands, it'd be hard to really get my proportions right. So we're going to use a gestural ink wash as a tool to find shape and then work into rendering and detail with our pastels. So when working with ink, I like to have a couple of values. I'll have one that's a darker wash and one that's a lighter wash. And a good way to set this up for yourself is to have two different sized jars. One that has, even if they're the same size, just one that has more water and one that has less. And if you have a jar with a lid that you can screw on it and shake that up, that's a great way to integrate the ink evenly to your water. Okay, ink can be messy, so have a cloth on hand. Here's some of my ink brushes. Ink can be a great way to get a gestural shape and then render in on top of that with other mediums. So today we're going to explore pastel, but you could also explore acrylic on top of ink washes and oil. Ink's a great foundation. So I've got my two jars here, and you always want to test out what values you're working with before you start working with them. And also, for good measure, I'll often add just a drop of a color into my black ink to give it just some volume and some body. I like to go with some reds or browns. Okay, so now I'm going to play around with doing a ink wash as a base and then coming in with some pastels to render on top of that. If we were working from a model, I would use my ink wash as a gesture to do a gesture of the model's body. But because we're working with the still life, I'm going to do a little bit of drawing to know where I want my lights and darks. So I threw up a gray scarf in between my white object and white background. So now I've got areas that are clearly gray and areas that are clearly white. So the great thing about ink is I can be kind of messy with it. my favorite thing, people mix mediums in all different ways, but why I mix mediums is because I really like to go back and forth between drawing and painting. So I could be working with an acrylic wash right now, but I'm essentially painting atmosphere. And then to render, I'm gonna go in with my drawing tools, like my pastels or even colored pencils. Okay, so I might let this dry and then I'll come back in and do a second ink wash. I could even do it now while as it's drying to get some of those darker folds, some of those darker values in. Find the background, the backdrop where my cloth starts coming up. Now if you want, while this is wet, you could even start using your Neocolor water-soluble pastels, which react to water. I recommend, if you are using these, to do some testing on other surfaces before you begin drawing, because you'll notice that as I wet this area, this comes off of the crayon like butter when it meets water. But when it meets a non-wet surface, it's more like a crayon, which you could then later bring water into to move around. So yeah, again, just to reiterate, this is what excites me so much about using drawing materials and painting materials. I'm going back and forth between painting and drawing. So it can be very, very gestural, very physical, and then I can get into rendering and thinking, using our drawing exercises of contour and measuring to get into detail and shading with your drawing utensils, which could be any of the pastels. It could be on top of this ink wash. I could use oil pastel, I could use chalk pastel, I could use Neocolor oil wax pastels or the water soluble pastels. You just can't use chalk and basically any water-based medium on top of oil. So if you're using an oil pastel, that's kind of your final layer. And oil paint goes for that as well. And I like to use the sides of my pastels, whether you're working with chalk, oil, or water soluble, because you can cover so much ground that way. But it's a lot about exploration, and really it comes, mixed media, doing it well comes down to how well do you know your materials. So a lot of this will be for you guys who are working with pastels, ink, and even paint for the first time. There's going to be a lot of exploration involved. So here's the piece that I've been working on with a little more rendering, and I've been using all of our drawing tech exercises, from contour to atmospheric and even gestural, and blind contour in the sense that I'm really looking sometimes, like this line, to find that curve. I was, for the most part, keeping my eye on the subject of what I was drawing. And I could keep working on this until the cows come home, as they say. And it's by no means what I call it a finished piece, but it's certainly a great study, and it's been a great exercise playing with my pastels on top of my ink wash.